Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see you here. Thanks for coming out. I'm Kate Casey, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Saumitra Jha and Anat Admati, and we are all professors here at the GSB with an interest in democracy around the world. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to start out, my primary role is as moderator, but I want to start out just putting this question of democratic backsliding in a little bit of perspective, both historical perspective and global perspective. So here is data from Freedom House. So Freedom House is a think tank. They're sort of an activist champion organization of democracy around the world. And they've been collecting data on the strength of democracy for 50 years now. So this is their scores in terms of how free countries are. So these are all countries. There's 195 countries and another, I think, 15 territories in the data as of this year. And basically what they're doing is, this is rolling averages, so 5-year rolling averages, is saying, kind of what direction are countries going in terms of freedom. So the scale is from 1 is the most free, so negative numbers are good, and 7 is not free, right? So you're going through this, and this is just saying, how are those numbers on average changing over time? So what you see here is these are all gains in freedom. So these are kind of more democratic, more political freedom, more civil liberties. So these are all positive years when lots of countries are becoming more democratic and more free. And then what you see is that it flips over around 2009, 2010, and you have these positive numbers, which means they're actually decreasing freedom, increasing in terms of being more authoritarian. So I want you to first think about historically a little bit. So this is what is called the so-called third wave of democratization, right? So the numbers of countries, basically more than 30 countries switched to democracy in this period, which more than doubled the number of democracies around the world. So this was this huge increase in democracy. And this phrase comes from this scholar, so Samuel Huntington. He was a very famous and celebrated political economist at Harvard. And he wrote this book, Democracy's Third Wave. I'll just point it out. It's in 1991, right? So they're celebrating this kind of unprecedented level of increase in democracy around the world. But what's interesting is this is the third wave, right? So there was a second wave and there was a first wave. So the first wave started a long time ago, right? So it started in the 1820s, and that's basically extending the franchise to some men in some wealthy countries, right? So that goes on all the way up until, I don't know, about 1922. Then you get Mussolini coming in Italy, and then you get the first reversal, right? So each wave is followed by a reversal. Okay, so then the second wave comes in after World War II, and that goes up. So the first wave, we got to 29 democracies, then it dropped down to 12, and then the second wave it gets up to 36, and then the 1960s there's smaller reversal, so it goes down to 30, and then you get the big wave, right? And this is from 1974 through 1990, and that's when you get another 30 countries. So there's kind of two things to keep in mind here. So one is that, when we're thinking about this as a wave of reversals, it's not completely out of the historical context in terms of like a pendulum that is swinging between democracy and more authoritarianism. But the other thing is this book was not a triumphant, oh, fantastic, the whole world's democratized. The basic point of this article is speculating about where the trend is going to go next. Right? Thinking about what are the factors around the world that increase democracy, what are those that reduce them, where are those present, basically where does he think it's going to go. And he really doesn't come up with any sort of predictions. He's basically saying it could go either way. Okay, so what we're worried about today is this period of democratic backsliding. And so this is a period of decreasing freedom, but it's also a period of increasing instability. So this Freedom House organization, they write country reports for all of these countries. And this is just a simple plot that's basically saying, okay, how many total sentences are in the annual report? What share of those sentences are talking about political instability? And that's just the distribution across countries in 2000, sort of peak democracy, and in 2020. Right, what you can see is just this rightward shift, that there's a lot more talk about political instability now than 20 years ago. Right, so I think this is part of like the level of anxiety, is because there's democratic backsliding, and there's also just a lot of instability, which creates a lot of uncertainty on where things are going next. Okay, but this is not the only way to measure democracy, so I want to show you a few stats. So one criticism of Freedom House and similar organizations is a lot of the things they code are quite subjective in nature. Right? And so there's criticisms that maybe some of this coding reflects biases, and maybe these coders are coding things in a way that sort of aligns with their own preferences or beliefs in a way that might bias these estimates. So there's two political scientists here who said, okay, let's actually strip out all the subjective measures in these measures of democracy and just go for the objective ones, right? So it's like, if you think about subjective versus objective, objective is, okay, there was an election, the incumbent lost, did they leave office, right? A subjective one could say, was that election free and fair? So inherently more difficult to quantify, right? But you need both, right? So what The Economist has done is they've taken from all of these big sort of clearinghouses of data, they've taken about 300 indicators. They do this kind of factor analysis. They're trying to say which of these indicators move together, and let's reduce the dimensionality from 300 down to just like 2 indices, right? And what they find is these basically, by having a data-driven approach, they kind of collect on 2 factors. One is about state capacity. There's really a lot more of those objective indicators, and to be honest, a lot of this ties pretty closely to GDP per capita, right? So richer countries tend to have higher state capacity. And then political liberalism is you know, it incorporates a lot more of the more subjective human-coded indicators. But I just want to emphasize, you can't get rid of these, right? Because values and freedom and equity might be harder to quantify, but they are equally important, right? But what they're trying to do is break these into sort of 2 dimensions of what they think about democracy and where it's going. So the first thing to take away is state capacity is not falling drastically over this period, right? If anything, it's holding pretty steady. It's this kind of liberalism that's falling. So just to give you a better sense, so what is liberalism? It's like free and impartial press, an independent judiciary, civil liberties, openness to the world, a kind of more distributed, like broadly distributed political power. And so, you know, the countries that do well on this, you know, there's some there, so think about Norway, New Zealand, Germany, Costa Rica, right? Now, the other dimension is state capacity, which I was just mentioning. So again, this is like, can you maintain law and order? Can you provide basic public goods and services? Can you manage the economy in a sensible way? Right, so you see here, these tend to be rich. So here's like Denmark and Switzerland, but they aren't necessarily democratic, right? So we've got Singapore and United Arab Emirates here, which are all very strong, capable states, but differ a lot in terms of these sort of civil liberties that they allow and protect. Okay, so the interesting thing now to do is to look at how do these 2 dimensions change and kind of where are countries going. So we're going to look at it from 2008 to 2022. All right, so they're kind of going in all directions. So a small number of countries are getting better on both. So they're building their capacity and they're getting kind of more politically liberal. So here they kind of, this is from The Economist, they're sort of shouting out Malaysia, which had this corruption scandal, and then the opposition party took power for the first time in 2018, right? So that's, they're getting stronger state, but they're also more politically liberal. But a lot of them are getting worse on both. So some are having small changes like Denmark, maybe a little bit worse, but then you have others like Venezuela has pretty catastrophically imploded both in terms of state and economic institutions, and the US is in this category, so that's the US there, right? So by both of these measures, capacity is going down a bit, and it's getting less liberal. Okay, but the majority, like not the majority, the plurality of countries are kind of going similar or getting stronger in capacity, but are really falling in liberalism, right? So this is kind of the most common scenario over the last 14 years in terms of where countries around the world are going. So this is just meant to sort of frame the discussion with a little bit of data. How do we quantify these things? What does the world look like? What does history look like? I'm going to pass it over to Anat. She's going to talk about democratic backsliding. Then we'll pause for a bit of Q&A, and then we'll pass it over to Saum, who will talk about social media, corruption, and democratic values.
Thanks, Kate. And hi, everybody. So I'm going to go into more of the nitty-gritty and much more specific about institutions and about mechanisms for how this happens and why this happens, and some more sort of micro level. First of all, I have to say, why am I here? I'm a finance and economics professor, and how come I'm talking about democracy here? So I'm going to flash a few slides telling you that I am legit here. And I've written about it, and I talk about it, and I teach about it, and I have centers about it, and all this kind of stuff. So very quickly, the background for me is the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, which kind of awoken me to the realities of the financial system. So I changed everything. Everything's changed for me. And among other things, I wrote this book, and this book has a part that was added in 2024, which actually has the word democracy in the title. So this in red is Undermining Democracy and the Rule of Law about banking. I want to talk to, we had an event about it last year, those, and I'm talking to alumni, some of whom are online, on the 7th of November about this book. So, but I'm not going to talk here about banking. What I'm trying to do is educate much more broadly than in the classroom or in my research, because the education is important for democracy. This is a quote from Jefferson that's at the University of Virginia, where my son went to law school. So in the museum there, I saw it and took a picture of it, and I'm using it. Now, Sam is going to talk more about social media, but this book that we quote at the end of our book, because we end with, noise and post-fact and all this stuff. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And this book was written in 1985. 85, just think about this. No internet, you were not born yet. No, some of you may have been, I don't know. The alums may have, but anyway, I'm thinking in terms of my kids. But anyway, he was complaining about, cable television. It was about communication. This guy's a communication expert. This is taught in Columbia Communication School of Journalism, et cetera, et cetera. His son republished it in 2005. 2005 was before, mobile social media, but there was internet already. And what he's saying is, he doesn't like, breaking for commercials and short things, and everything is sound bites and all of that. So he's saying we don't have time for serious discussions about anything. People have to look good, all this stuff. It's too much entertainment. And he was saying our public discourse has become dangerously nonsense. So he was worried not about 1984, somebody telling you what to think, but more about the Huxley, that we will voluntarily become confused about everything. So that was the concern. Of course, take that to today, and that was like 40 years ago, in our communication, systems today. So I started writing about democracy related to this. So this is one piece. Democracy and prosperity require uncorrupted governments. This was wrote in 2020. I wrote an essay when asked what's gone wrong with capitalism. And what I said was, among other things, this is not what I'm going to talk about today. In the rest of the talk, the forces of capitalism have kind of weakened and overwhelmed democracies because of private power has become very, very meaningful in the economy. And the governments basically, couldn't deliver, or they got themselves kind of overwhelmed by their interaction with the private sector. And I also pointed to deception and manipulation of beliefs as a tool of power in markets and in politics. So the lobbying and the marketing convince you to buy things or buy ideas, accept ideas, that influencing, that persuasion. This is a recent piece I wrote, again, for Volume on Democracy in Project Syndicate, Accountability, Hold the Keys to Restoring Trust in Capitalism. And this is sort of, we live in a post-truth world. Do we have facts at all? And what I've noticed is that, and what I try to do in my writing is, if you educate, maybe you reduce the noise and you reduce the confusion, because when people are very angry and confused, then somebody can tap on that anger, and that's a component of the, so it's going to go, where I'm going to is sort of this grievance strategy, where you tap into people's anger and you take them places. So this is what I wrote. Free speech and democratic institutions are no guarantees that there'll be good policy if people get confused, or intentionally or willfully blind to truth, or that they'll be happy. So what we see here, nominally a democracy where people are angry and unhappy, and maybe where policies are really bad. And so the discontent is justified, but it's taken off in the directions that lead to this. So that's my observation from what I have seen, both in banking and elsewhere. I have a new MBA course, so I'm advertising this here. Check it out. And I have an initiative which has, the reason I put this is because we actually have a related event on Thursday with Bill Browder, which will touch on issues of autocracy and democracy. Obviously, he was encountered some tough situations. And I even have a program called Capitalism and Democracy over at the center across the street of Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. That's a collaboration with the business school. So now, going into the issues, related very much to what Kate was talking about, this is state capacity and something called political liberalism in 4 countries over a history. So what you see here is specifically for Germany, what happened, prior to Second World War, the huge decline in their democracy, Hitler. You see, in other stories would be Italy and Mussolini around the same time. You see Hungary here, which came into the wave that Kate mentioned here and became democratic, only to have a big decline. And you see the United States with the decline that was mentioned, and you see Venezuela in its sort of big, huge ups and downs. So these are countries with some recession depending on the measures. But I also looked at a different article that looks at backsliding from 2005 to 2022 by the Carnegie Foundation. And they ended up sort of defining it as you come from 2 of these measurements being good sometime after 2005 to 2 measurements significantly getting worse, but not getting better. So it's kind of really declined over that period, and they ended up with these 27 countries, which they say most of them are kind of retreating from the third wave that was mentioned, with the one exception being the United States. So I'm going to narrow in on the United States now. So here's the United States, democracy. So I'm going to talk about what is democracy. Because here we were measuring, but I'm not going to talk about aggregate measures. I'm going to get down on the ground, the institutions. Democracy, government, so this is the big, for the people, by the people. And the word is very popular and sometimes confusing because, you have the Democratic People's Republic, and so people use that word a lot. And in fact, so this is from Freedom House, misrepresentation of the word is a testament to how people want to claim it. So a lot of time you'll have the populace saying, I'm for democracy, you're not. So it's like they use that word because it's kind of a good word. But obviously democracy is not just elections. So this already came out, 300 measures, or however much. There is a World Justice Project, which is another one of those. I think they're good. So here is, in fact, democracy means more than a majority rule. It's a governing system based on the will and consent of the governed, institutions that are accountable to all citizens, adherence to the rule of law, respect for human rights, a network of mutually reinforcing structures in which those exercising power are subject to checks, both within and outside the state, for example, from independent courts, independent press, civil society. So it's complicated. It's complicated. And what you need for democracy, if it's healthy, is you need enough committed citizens who believe in the enterprise of democracy. They believe in distributed power as opposed to concentrated power. They believe in informed debate. They believe in compromise. Those are kind of the healthy democracies, kind of qualitatively. And you need a set of institutions and rules that will include all these gatekeepers and creating checks and balances to guard against accumulation of power in a few people or one person. Okay, so that's supposed to be a good democracy. But what if some people, or what if some powerful people don't really want democracy? That would be where it sort of starts breaking from within, and the backsliding will happen. If they're not committed to that, and, I don't want to name names around or anything like that, but, we could, might these people who are powerful be able to change the rules and change the institutions so that we will have this backsliding? And then they will get the power and not the accountability. So there will somehow be a breakdown in this interlocking system. And then we'll get the backsliding, we'll get autocracy, we'll get corruption. So the study by the Carnegie Foundation was sort of going through some of the theories that have been proposed by various political scientists about what's the underlying cause of democratic backsliding. Is it just, it's all Russia and China. They are meddling with our democracies. It's a sort of a race between autocracies and democracies, and the autocrats are kind of winning. It's sort of a title of a piece actually by Frank Fukuyama from here. They claim that the autocracies that are trying to meddle with democracies, they are trying to meddle through social media, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, they're trying to sow more polarization and more fake news or whatever. But they're claiming that if you look at the whole picture, most of what the autocracies are doing to the democracies is once there's backsliding, they kind of help it harden. So I'll get to that at the very end. I'll end with that point of the hardening. It's kind of the autocrats club that they create. And then social media, so some will talk about that. They are claiming that there's mixed evidence. Some countries that had declines or increases did or didn't have a lot of social media, in terms of people even having it or whatever. And so, I'm not going to go there. Some will discuss this somewhat. And they also claim that populism by itself is sort of mixed. Some countries declined with populism or increased with populism or whatever. Polarization is important, but it's like, is it the cause or is it the result of the backsliding? So that's not so clear. And then this notion of economic inequality, anger for that reason, democracy is just not doing their job. That was certainly what I observed in banking, that democracy was not working to get the good rules. And there are books to that effect, Adam Tooze, The World Changed because of the financial crisis, and certainly that's a theme. But it just created the democracy is not delivering, created the grievances that themselves then fed into the backsliding. So bottom line is most of what this is about is domestic political actors that are kind of leading to the backsliding. So the backslide is from within. And the mechanisms that are the main ones that are observed in the countries that have this backsliding are, first of all, so it's about leaders, it's about political actors, and what they will do or want to do is mobilize some grievance. and then take it to suggest that because of this grievance and because our institutions are responsible for the grievance, that we should dismantle those institutions, and then that would solve the problem. And these institutions, the democratic institutions, are preventing the solution of these problems that they have. So that could be anything from, people angry with corruption, with inequality, about the financial crisis, about mismanagement by the government. There are different cases that they point out in this Carnegie study. And, in India or the US or the Philippines, it would sort of tap into other underlying kind of forces like, anti-immigrant feelings, or, there are people using drugs, we got to kill them, et cetera, et cetera. The other sort of set of forces has to do with the leader just wanting power. How they get into power could be legit or normal, like not grievance-based, but just normal promising things and, campaigning. And once get power, then they want to keep it. And then it becomes about them maintaining their power. And then that's what they'll start using corrupt networks for, and all of that. And that's kind of illiberalism without a cause. It's not to solve some problem, or at least not claim to solve some problem. It's just naked, power grab. And then there are a few countries that had military coming back to power. Okay, I'm almost done. So this is a book from which I took some of the rest of this stuff. And it was written in 2018. This is kind of a year after Trump was written, mostly, 2017. And they're saying that they're scared, and these are two political scientists from Harvard. The book is recommended, and they're talking more, not about formal rules, but more about informal rules, about political and democratic norms, and how the norms broke. And the two norms that they talk about specifically are mutual toleration, that different parties tolerate the legitimacy of one another, and forbearance, meaning I have power, but I'm not using all of it. And so the four indicators of regression in this and breakdown of norms is rejecting the outcome of the election, denying the legitimacy of the other party, everybody's the enemy, tolerating violence, and being ready to curtail, the media, add libel or whatever, all of which they observed in 2015-16 already, saying this is the first time they observe all these four that they have seen in other democratic breakdowns like, Mussolini or Chavez or Hitler, that they are seeing this for the first time in the US. This is very brief, but it's in that book. The US basically doesn't have a great history, so the notion that we're special and unique is wrong. Born not fully democratic, civil war, obviously, and after the Civil War, the democratic norms were achieved at the cost of putting aside issues of racial equality. So, as long as we don't talk about that, we could be politically okay with one another. So it became, according to them, only democratized in 65. But where they start, the backsliding of the norms is in the 80s and then going into 2000, when it was all war and dysfunction and closure, and I won't discuss your nominees and things that were never done before. No compromise, Newt Gingrich, and after that. So I'm almost done. This is the cartoon of the frogs in the boiling water. My calculation says we're boiling alive. Oh, no, don't worry. Just an alarmist, all of that. So until they boil. So this is a well-known thing about how you kind of don't realize when it changes very gradual, that you don't realize it. And then it actually becomes very, very big and you're boiling, but you didn't realize what was going on. So this is, the almost imperceptible changes that add up. Final two books I recommend. One is called Spin Dictator. So this is about styles of tyranny, which is not violent, but is more propaganda-based. These are modern authoritarians that basically convince people that it's a democracy, convince people that they are the best leaders, all of that. So that's basically the Putin, Erdogan, and Orban kind of strategy, Spin Dictator. And final slide is a very recent book by Ann Applebaum, who's very insightful about the issue of democracy. And her book ties back to capitalism, because in this book she talks about autocracy Inc. And now she talks about, money laundering and oligarchs, all of that. So autocrats so that's about the club, about these corrupt networks, sophisticated networks of, both propaganda and money flows. And what she's saying is that if democracies want to fight, they need to change the rules, for example, about anonymous corporations and things like that, because that's how half of New York or London are owned by anonymous corporations, the things of that. So she's saying we're not succeeding in sanctions, we're not succeeding in anything because we've allowed this the democracies have kind of allowed this, and that's something that I'm interested in. That's it.
Okay. So small change of plan. We're just going to power through. So we'll hear from Saum, and then we'll just have all the questions at the end.
It's such a delight to be here. I also want to give a shout out to our alums. It's really wonderful to see some familiar names on the list. So I'm going to talk about a bit more of sort of three important issues that I want you to think about when it comes to democratic backsliding. One is the role of social media, one is the role of what I'm going to call apex corruption, and the other one is how they connect together in undermining democratic values. So, as we've already kind of talked about, we live in a world of political polarization. If you look at surveys of Democrats saying how warm they feel towards Democrats versus how warm they feel towards Republicans and the reverse, we're kind of at fairly extreme levels. People don't like people across the sides of the spectrum. And you can imagine what can happen in a democratic environment as we polarize away from the center. People might feel, well, maybe the democratic system, these checks and balances, these moderation types of activities which keep the politics sort of in the middle are not working for us as we kind of go further and further to the side. So there's a reason why we might be worried that polarization might be directly related towards people saying, well, maybe democracy isn't all it's cracked out to be. Secondly, this is kind of a picture you've already seen, the kind of the decline in liberal democracy over time. And this is not just an American phenomenon. It's not just an Indian phenomenon. It is happening in various parts of the world. Who's benefiting? Well, it seems like right-wing and left-wing populists are finding room in many different environments as a result. Every time there's an election, I always feel a bit chilled because I'm not sure whether that election is going to go smoothly and there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. This was not as much an issue a few years ago, but now I think, how many of you feel this kind of chill about what's going to happen in the next few months? I definitely do, and I feel it every time there's an election in many countries right now. So, with respect to Meng and Little, from my perspective, there are objective things that we should be worried about as well. At the same time, I think one aspect which I think hasn't been explored so much is the role of corruption. There's been maybe as a good thing, exposure of corruption has risen around the world. We see scandals breaking out, often implicating the top of governments in many different environments, many different places. In fact, if you look at media mentions, we scrape LexisNexis, it's count 4 times as many mentions of corruption in Spanish, and around twice as much in English in the last few years. So corruption is very much in the media, and it's very much in the media a lot more than it used to be. And oftentimes it involves the guys at the very top. At the same time, satisfaction with democracy has plummeted, not just in including in the United States as well as in Latin America and Mexico, but this is a more of a general phenomenon. It's kind of striking to me that if you think about satisfaction with democracy in the US has gone to below less than 60% of the people in this country are satisfied with democracy at this point in time. If you look at the same time, perceptions of widespread government corruption have been increasing in all of these settings. In the US, more than 70% think that there's widespread government corruption going on right now. And the US is not a very corrupt country by most metrics. Yet, if you can see, the perceptions of corruption are around the same levels as much of Latin America and Mexico as well. So we're losing our faith in our institutions, not just in the US, but elsewhere as well, right? So what I want to talk about are three different things. One, I want to talk about the role of media, the mobile internet, and social media in particular, and give you some new evidence that coming out of the literature on the role of social media echo chambers and their contributions to polarization. I'm going to talk a bit about technology, the role of smartphones and 3G technology in particular, and how that's been related to the fall in the faith in government, a rise in populism, and the role of corruption in all of that. Then I'm going to talk particularly about some of my own research, which is about apex corruption, corruption at the very top. I'm going to talk about why this could be particularly bad for democracy. And I'm going to emphasize the role of what we call strategic complementarities in particular, this idea that if it makes sense for me to act in a corrupt manner if I believe that other people are acting in a corrupt manner. This is a kind of a coordination game. And so if people believe that the world is corrupt, they're going to be more likely to be corrupt. Leaders can shape those coordination types of activities in much more than the average Joe or Josephine can. And so corruption at the top can be particularly bad for undermining norms, beliefs, and organizations related to democratic institutions. But I think it comes with a moment of hope. So it suggests that if there's corruption at the top, maybe there's a room for apex honesty at the top too. If we believe that there's new people coming in who are leaders who are honest and are not going to tolerate corruption, this could actually change the people's willingness to believe that others are going to act corruptly, and actual individuals can make a difference in the way that corruption is coordinated. Now, I'm going to say that sounds wonderful, but there's also two dark sides to that as well. Economics is a dismal science, as you know. One is that oftentimes the people we kind of put up on the pedestal as apex honest might not turn out to be quite at that level, and that can really crush perceptions even more. The second thing is that sometimes folks who are in this position where they are honest themselves and see corruption around them, what's a natural response? Well, the natural response is, well, let's centralize power. Let's, these democratic checks and balances, the system is broken. Maybe I, as an honest leader, should be centralizing my authority in order to rescue the country. And so, ironically, people who are honest leaders can actually be very deleterious for democratic institutions. And so that's another takeaway I want you to think about. The third is that we of course, we're social scientists. We want to prove that this is the case. So we use a number of different ways including a randomized control trial, as well as event study evidence to show that these relationships between apex corruption and the undermining of democratic values are causally related. And that's sort of the topic of some of my own research. All right, so this is all I'm going to. So I want to start with talking about social media, media in general. And I think the most convincing work I've seen on the role of social media and polarization is this very new paper. It's not published yet, by Braghieri and co-authors. And what they do is they take the universe of all of the top 100 US media outlets, every single hard news article that was published in them in 2019. We're talking about millions of articles here. The first thing they do is they kind of show that, not surprisingly, these media outlets have a political slant, as you might expect, and those go along with kind of other people's codings of these things. They use sort of natural language processing to code all of the outlets and all of the articles. Now, what I think is more interesting is they find that when it comes to hard news articles, actually, even though the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal might have different slants, when they report hard news, often what they report is very centrist. There's very little slant on those things. If you look at this kind of thing in the middle, that's actually quite remarkable. In fact, a lot of the variance in slant is occurring within outlets. It's, sorry, I read the New York Times. Ross Douthat, Brooks, all the Paul Krugman, people kind of commenting with the same newspaper have very different political perspectives, right? Note, however, so 65% of the variation is not whether you read the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Times, which is fairly right-wing, or San Francisco Chronicle. It's within those outlets what people are reporting on. Secondly, there are fat tails. You can see that they're kind of, it's not just everyone's reporting centrist stuff. There is extreme stuff in these outlets. Now, lo and behold, what do you think is getting propagated on social media? In order to figure out what that was, they basically used Facebook's, they made it, with Facebook, it allowed you to follow everything which was reposted more than 100 times on Facebook. And they took the universe of that, and they looked at what was being shared on Facebook. And it's not the centrist news. It's always the more extreme stuff. Furthermore, who is watching these things? Well, it turns out, surprisingly or not surprisingly, the liberals are being exposed to these liberal, more extreme liberal types of news, and the conservatives are being exposed to the more conservative types of news. So, I think for me, this is fairly convincing evidence that social media is directly kind of feeding into these media echo chambers. And it wasn't the conventional wisdom actually in our profession, because of important research which had kind of said that this wasn't the case, but they were looking at the outlet level. If you look at the article level, you see a very different picture. So a second thing is, what's driving this exposure? And so some recent work, again, by Sergei Guriev, who Anat mentioned, Nikita Melnikov and Katya Zhuravskaya kind of try to understand what happens when technology is expanding, and in particular the access to mobile internet, which meant that smartphones were becoming more and more available. So as Europe and the world basically got more exposed to 3G coverage, which allowed mobile internet, what they find is that basically people get pissed off with their governments. The incumbents' vote share tends to fall. Furthermore, who benefits from this? It's the right-wing populists and the left-wing populists. The non-populists aren't benefiting from these things. So it seems, again, like it's, as these things are propagated, extreme voices are becoming magnified, and who's losing? It's mostly the centrists, right? There are some exceptions to this pattern. Well, if you're a government which censors your internet, you don't find a difference. So 3G expands, but it doesn't affect the strength of your government. The squeakiest clean, by which I mean not the United States, but Switzerland and Denmark, their government actually gets more support as they discover, oh yeah, we're actually as clean as we thought we were. But even a little bit of dirt, and I include the US very much in that category, was enough to undermine some of the support for the government, right? So I think that this is kind of an important thing to think about, that technology, access to information, should be a good thing for democracy. But as it propagates certain things, views about corruption and ideas about corruption, this can have kind of deleterious effects as well. How much time am I doing for time?
You still have 7 minutes.
Okay, great. So why do we care about people at the top, leaders, rather than sort of average Joe? So I just Googled corruption in Delhi, and this is from today, 2 Delhi cops were caught taking a bribe. That kind of thing is fairly commonplace, let's be honest. But why is it different to when, for example, the El Salvador's president is caught in these positions, or someone much more at the top of the pyramid? Well, I think there's 3 reasons. One is that they're the most apex politicians. Leaders are the most, at that level, are the most focal, right? And as we mentioned, if for example, Lula, the president of Brazil, is implicated in that, not only I see it, I know that everyone else is seeing it as well, right? Not everyone is seeing that there's a signal of corruption at the very top, right? This can, because of strategic complementarities, because I believe that it makes sense to accept a bribe, take a bribe, if I think others are doing the same. This can increase the level that people believe of corruption existing in society, right? At the same time, they're more likely to be role models. I mean, people might say, well, if this person that we all respect, or at least close to 50% of us respect, is doing this, maybe it's okay, right? So this can also change internalized views about what's the right thing to do. And frankly, they're the more influential. People might think, well, Lula's the president. Do we believe that these, the institutions of government, the electoral process will be inured from the fact that there's corruption at the very top as well? So organizations could be undermined also. So this is dark, but this is why, it also, as I mentioned, creates this possibility, that if you have leaders who are honest at the very top and are willing to signal that in very kind of costly ways, this could actually lead to a societal change potentially. And so we actually show with a randomized control trial along with cross-country evidence that apex corruption does in fact affect all of these components of liberal democracy: beliefs, norms, and pro-democratic voting behaviors like volunteering to support the democratic organizations related to the electoral institutions, as well as voting itself, right? So what happens when you believe corruption is widespread, like in the US at the moment? Well, someone coming along saying draining the swamp becomes a very attractive platform. And this is an attractive platform not just in the US, it's an attractive platform in many, many environments as well, right? So in fact, in Mexico, one of the places we were studying, they were in a position where the former president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, had been seen as entirely complicit in a lot of corrupt activities. His successor, AMLO, basically campaigned as an anti-corruption crusader. He became, and he personally did certain things. He was very frugal. He cut down on all the corporate cars and all the rest of it. And he kind of lived in a life that people believed that he is actually personally a clean person. Again, I think many people would think that Narendra Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, is not personally a corrupt person as well. And that actually gives him, he comes from a very humble background. He's not raking in the cash as far as we know. This actually gives him a possibility of being much more effective as kind of someone in this kind of apex honesty position. But it also could actually be deleterious for democracy as well. If people believe, well, the substitution between democracy, corrupt democracy, and personal probity and leadership, strong leadership, is a trade-off, then this can lead to an undermining of support for democracy also, right? So what we show kind of empirically is we do a number of things to kind of show that this is a causal relationship, because a lot of things could be driving these things. One of them is using the fact that oftentimes countries are surveyed, for a variety of reasons, and some of those surveys happen to take place just before and just after major corruption scandals break out, implicating the top people. And in Latin America, you can see that just after one of these major apex corruption scandals, people believe that corruption is more pervasive around the country. Their support for democracy falls. The trust in institutions fall, and the support for authoritarianism also rises. They also report being less likely to vote. We show using a randomized control trial that this is actually causal. We did this in Oaxaca, Mexico, where we actually went door to door and we randomized people to see raw footage of various types of corrupt activity taking place, some involving the brother of the incumbent president, who was seen as very honest, others involving the opposition. We tried to counter this by seeing whether we could rebuild democracy in two ways, using kind of an idea from the nation building literature that maybe if we can remind people of the sacrifices Mexicans had made together, the fortitude they've shown in the case of adversity, the ways that they have built democracy, we could encourage people to again turn out in spite of these things. Turns out it didn't work very well. The other thing we did is we tried to kind of in common with some of my other research, see whether if we gave people common financial exposures, the ability to invest together in the national economy and learn about and focus on the common good, whether this could also have an effect. And we found somewhat promising results there. That it kind of increased support for trust and willingness to turn out to vote to some extent as well. During the course of our study, actually, a second brother of the president also was implicated in a corruption scandal. And so we also wanted to see whether this cumulates. One brother seems like it's unfortunate, two brothers seems like a pattern. And we find that, in fact, that is the case, that there is this accumulation impact as well. So kind of just to summarize, I think it's fairly, I think it does seem to be the case that the expansion of technology and social media have really kind of reinforced certain amounts of echo chamber types of effects, such that we are getting very polarized information, often involving allegations of corruption at the very highest levels. This is undermining our support for our democratic institutions, and this is not happening just in the US, it's happening around the world. Now, I want to emphasize that apex corruption at the very top is particularly important and hasn't been studied as much as I think it should, but it also creates room for apex honesty, for leadership and people who could actually re-coordinate the equilibrium. So this is why I'm delighted to be in the room with you and with our alums, because you guys could do these things, and I'm looking forward to you to kind of turn the page on some of the things that we're seeing right now, and maybe create the fourth wave of democracy. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, I'm just going to collect a bunch of questions, and just raise your hand, and then we can, I'll just write them down quickly. Yeah.
For Anat, what evidence do you see of objective, like backsliding of democracy in the US? And then like kind of on the subjective side, like how do you kind of code for language where John Adams and Thomas Jefferson might have, hated each other and said they were evil, but they never used the word evil, versus today Trump's very happy to use that word as just as like a fair subjective measure?
Yeah.
Let me collect a few, and then we can do another round. Yeah.
I was curious to get your take on states that are not quite democratic but well-functioning. Thinking of countries like Singapore and Rwanda. Is it just because the leaders are competent and relatively benevolent, or is it because they have slightly democratic structures that has checks and balances?
Okay.
Yeah, my question is more related to the future. When we look at the past, and in the early part of the century, the 19th century, we saw like dictatorship, and then we got it more democratic, and then does this come like economic cycles? It's also in cycles, the democratic phase, and this is what it's going to peak up, and then we'll all realize that again it's going to drop down. Is that what the patterns that you're seeing from your studies?
Yep.
Do you see a link between anonymous leadership and well-functioning or trust in the government? And I'm asking, I'm from Switzerland, and I don't know who is my president. And I think 50% of adults will answer, I don't know. And it seems to be working.
Let me take one more. Yeah.
It doesn't feel like we sometimes can systematically incentivize apex honesty at the top. I think I've seen studies that show like when a prominent leader does some sort of bad deed, when they apologize, they're seen as or perceived as worse than someone who does not apologize and refuses to apologize. I'm wondering how we can incentivize apex honesty systematically.
Okay, but we'll take some of these and we'll do another whip round. Do you want to start? So the first one is about what is the objective evidence about backsliding?
Well, I mean, there are different measures that people use. So there is sort of trust in government, or these predictors of other measures, so the breakdown of norms and these kinds of things have predicted, serious declines in democracies in other places. So if you see them, you kind of worry. So that was sort of how democracies die thing. And then, the analysis of the mechanisms in the countries that appeared to be declining was sort of also showing the tactics of the people. And so, to the extent that we see those tactics, we think there has been decline. I mean, we have. So anyway, so that's that. What are other questions? And I might have. Oh, the benevolent dictators. I mean, that's a really great question, because it often seems like democracies like the U.S. are very dysfunctional. And, at some point in my own sort of search on the financial area, I was like, if the Chinese government decides to do something, they just do it. You know what I mean? Like or Singapore or places like that. So some of it is, I think, has to do with, civil service quality. I think we have a really awful situation in the U.S. in which we don't pay. And the government work is considered, there's just a hate of government in general, and it becomes self-fulfilling. Whereas there is more dignity in working for the government in, say, Singapore. We see them in MSX program a lot, these students. And they come from the government, go back to the government happily, and they tie the salaries of the government to the top CEOs. And so, it's respectable work, and there's continuity in it, not as much revolving. And all these mechanisms are just competence, and they are not as conflicted. They are not, anyway. So there are a lot of metrics of this kind of, capture and other things like that. That make it so that, democracy, it's more complicated. Non-democracies can deliver if they're not too corrupt. At the same time, on corruption, just one quick comment, a lot of corruption is by definition invisible. So a lot of secrecy jurisdictions, a lot of money laundering, and then, you have the leaks, Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, all of that. So then every so often we see it. So it's like what actually happens or what people perceive to be happening versus the news that come are kind of not always, they're coming sort of at random times. Anyway, let other talk.
I love the question about incentives. It's honesty. I think at some level, if you have to incentivize it, it's no longer. Well, I guess the Singapore has a model of that line. Just make it the conditions such that it's easier to be honest. I think is a better among our leaders. I think that's the first thing. The second one is, of course, selection. We need to have folks who are committed in such a way that they're willing to step up, and that's a very hard thing to do, because I think when people believe that you have to be corrupt or compromised in order to be a politician, then it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. So we need to break that as well, and so it's really a question of leadership.
I want to say one thing about this question, which is a little bit reflective, self-reflective on the business school here. We teach paths to power. My good friend Jeff Pfeffer teaches it. It's a very popular course, more popular than my course, where I talk about how power is used and abused. Because people want power. Now, I'm agnostic to power. I want more of it. I want to use it for good. But the path to power is not to admit, to apologize. The path to power is not pretty. So. The Economist, when reviewing the top business school classes I think a year ago, was saying that, was going through the syllabus of Path to Power, and saying that Xi Jinping may have not taken this course, but emulates the lessons, which is a little bit of a damning thing to say. But, the people like power. So society has to, what I'm saying is society has to be more discerning where power is not equal money, where we don't admire the people get away with stuff,
I think going back to Kat's question about these these sort of secure, not democratic states. So Rwanda, I think, is one thing that's underlying is people have preferences over order and security and stability that they might be willing to trade off against more freedom, more conflict, more public debate. I think Rwanda is an interesting one because coming out of genocide, right, that everybody's priority was peace, right? And Kagame had very heavy hands making sure that that didn't slide back into conflict. So I think that's a kind of an unusual situation. And I think then over time, then there's less human rights, less free press, and then the question is, what's the succession plan? Because he, as one leader, has been quite successful in growth and keeping peace, keeping security, but there is a question of when that one person needs to leave, what's the process and who's the next person, and what is the kind of system of government that's going to facilitate this over the longer?
Can I also be?
Yeah.
I think one interesting thing is that one-party states can actually have very effective governance, not because they don't have competition, but because the competition happens within the party or within the movement. And so, it's happening sort of at the lower levels, who gets to kind of selected up and so on and so forth. So it might not be appearing in the kind of who gets the vote at the end of the day, but it can be very effective at getting sort of effective leaders emerge from the grassroots. Of course, oftentimes that's not the case as well. So one-party states just end up being, one person.
Yeah. Okay, let me get these last two that had their hands up, and then, go ahead.
So you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation that democracy is partially about the willingness of the people to accept democracy as a process. So for a country like Russia, where I'm from, there's been debate about whether or not autocracy is a factor of the people just not being willing to accept anything other than an autocratic leader. Do you believe there's a future there, or?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. Something about, culture of democracy, or what people think is, to be expected, what they're used to. So certain habits about where, how power is structured in the economy, or what's worked. And then, the spin dictators is where they're kind of telling a narrative that the public accepts. So it becomes sort of a, self-reinforcing thing. But there is this thing, because that's why you kind of, people need to conceive that certain things are possible, and so if it's not in their experiences, they may not be thinking it's within reach. How do you get there, and how to organize it? And, obviously, Russia had an experience, the Soviet Union, when it broke, had the experience of really sort of, privatizing without institutions. It just didn't have any institutions. And it was very rushed, and then it ended up kind of imploding on itself. So it was kind of a bad experience in democratization. And so then it really backslid a lot.
I went to Russia in the 90s. I did some research there, and it was Yeltsin was president. It was a really optimistic and exciting time. And if you look at sort of the patterns of protests that happen around the country, I don't think that there's sort of a lack of democratic values per se, particularly in urban areas. I think it is the fact that there's a very strong and effective state, as Kate was saying, which is.
Once Putin was elected, was put in that position, that was sort of the end.
So I'm sort of long-term optimistic, but short-term, unfortunately, pessimistic.
Bill Browder on Friday, Thursday.
Well, let's adjourn here, but if anyone wants to come and chat with us, we can hang around. But thanks everybody for coming out.